I would suggest that those who are standing find a seat, even if a seat is supposedly reserved. Thank you all for coming. I'm Michael Crapon. I am called a diplomat scholar here at the University of Virginia. Those who are sticklers for the truth would say diplomat sick, scholar sick. But the role of diplomat scholars is to bring a little bit of the world of work into the learning experience of the students who are fortunate enough to be here. This program is the brainchild of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, Lee Grossman, who is hiding somewhere in this room. Here she is. And she has brought me and Leonard Robinson, my colleague, onto the campus or the grounds. Leonard has a series where foreign ambassadors come here to talk about what they worry about. And there are other programs that Lee has stimulated as the Vice Provost for International Affairs. Our talk today is a collaborative effort with the Vice Provost's office and the Miller Center. And I'm tickled to have George Gillum here, who's helped us put this program together. Okay, let's put our imagination caps on. I want you to try and imagine this. You're doing graduate work at Oxford, no less, and you're focusing on the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev is under house arrest. His memoirs are smuggled out, and you're asked to translate them for publication. Oh, and by the way, one of your housemates is going to become the President of the United States. It's not a bad start, and it was all uphill from there for our speaker, Strobe Talbott. There is no shortage of ego in Washington, D.C., and there is no shortage of talent in Washington, D.C. There is a shortage of people who have achieved a great deal with extraordinary talent that are not afflicted with large ego. And we're fortunate to have a speaker today who fits that characterization. Strobe Talbott has not only translated 2 volumes of Khrushchev Remembers, he's written or co-authored 6 books on the Cold War. No one has chronicled the nuclear arms competition between the United States and the Soviet Union with such clarity, accessibility, and insight as our speaker. His day job while he was doing this was at Time magazine, where he was the Washington bureau chief, among other important responsibilities. And he was eventually asked to help his old roommate, Bill Clinton, to manage what was then called the former Soviet Union, and this not so trivial problem of the breakup of a country that had a whole lot of nuclear weapons, and to try and get states that inherited significant parts of this arsenal to voluntarily give it up, which he did. He was then asked to work on a broader canvas, serving as Deputy Secretary of State in the second Clinton administration. One of his time-consuming assignments was to work with and manage the consequences of India and Pakistan testing nuclear weapons and then getting into some nuclear-tinged crises. He wrote a book on this subject. He also wrote an important book on the Russia problem, which I would commend to you. Strobe Talbott knows a fair amount about hard-edged partisanship. He experienced a lot of it when he served in the executive branch. And now he sits in a very different place. He's the head of one of the most prestigious think tanks in the United States, the Brookings Institution, where he is struggling with a problem that is not unique to think tanks. It's a problem that universities also face, which is how do we find space between people who are shouting at each other to try and get them to listen and listen to independent scholarship and independent public policy research, which is what the Brookings Institution is largely about. So it's a great privilege for me to get Strobe Talbott under the dome.
I'm looking around to see if there are any seats empty. I'm feeling a little guilty about the folks standing in the back of the room, but there's one here and a couple more, but what the heck, I got to stand up throughout all this, so I guess maybe you might too. Michael, I want to begin by thanking you not just for the introduction, but for being a friend and a mentor of mine for many, many years. A lot of what I've forgotten about arms control, and that's a lot, I learned from you when you were at the Stimson Center and before. And you are a diplomat and a scholar and a teacher. And I've had a terrific time in the few hours that I've been down here. I hope it's not going to be all downhill from the experience I just had, which was a chance to meet with Michael's seminar. And I can sum it up very briefly. The questions were a whole lot better than the answers. I was very, very impressed by the group of students I had a chance to meet with. I have some personal as well as professional reasons for being not just honored, but really delighted at the invitation to be here this afternoon. I've admired the Miller Center for a long time. I've admired the way in which it combines scholarship and public service. I've had a chance to be a beneficiary of the product of the Miller Center in some of the writing that I've done over the years on the subject of American foreign policy and various presidencies. I guess I can reveal myself even to be a source for the Miller Center, which is to say that in 2002, I think it was, I got in a more comfortable car than the one my wife and I have and drove down here with Warren Christopher to undergo 2 days of grilling as part of the Presidential Oral History Project. It was a memorable experience. Our interrogators were Stephen Knott, and Tim Naftali, and Russell Riley, and James Young, and Phil Zelikow. And they stayed well within the permissible bounds of the Geneva Convention, I want to assure you. But they extracted a lot from Chris and myself. And it made me appreciate all the work that goes into the extraordinary treasure that archive represents. I might add, speaking of Warren Christopher, that I bring greetings to all of you institutionally and to many of you personally from somebody who was and still maybe covertly still is Chris's right-hand man, and that's Tom Donnellan, who is both a trustee of the Miller Center and of the Brookings Institution. And finally, I want to thank this gentleman sitting down here in the front row, Bill Antholis, who had a lot to do with getting me down here and who is just about my closest colleague at the Brookings Institution. Now, Bill has several redeeming features. One is that he has the good sense to live in Charlottesville, even though his day job is in Washington. He lives in Charlottesville not because he's a UVA alumnus, although he is. He lives down here for a reason that is sitting next to him, and that's Kristen Swacco, who is his wife and who is connected with the Blue Moon Fund. Let me now, because we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I hope that a good deal of it will be in discussion with all of you, buckle down to the issue at hand, which Michael has already teed up for me. And that is the nexus between the life of the mind and the world of public affairs, or what might be called the intellectual commute between what my new friend Lee Grossman tells me is called the academical village, where all of you live, and the political village, where I live and where Bill comes to work several days a week. And I think that there is a special significance to addressing this subject in this extraordinary building, looking out across what I guess you, with some kind of understatement, call the lawn. Because I think the fact that one of our nation's founding fathers happens also to be the founder of your university is a pretty good starting point for the observations that I want to put before you. Thomas Jefferson personified, and I might even say epitomized, the proposition that good governance is based on good ideas. And good ideas are based on respect for facts, rigor in thinking, rationality in debate, and crucially, civility of discourse. Moreover, I associate Thomas Jefferson's name with the word independence, with a capital I. Two of the three accomplishments for which he wanted to be remembered, and surely is remembered, were the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom and, of course, the Declaration of Independence. And the third accomplishment, of which he was so justly proud, this university, was created with another I word, impact, in mind, which is to say the impact that this university would have on public affairs, especially through the education of good citizens and the education of people who would go on to be political leaders in both parties, to wit, a couple of UVA graduates such as Ted Kennedy and George Allen. Now, independence and impact are 2/3 of what Bill and I and our colleagues at Brookings have come to think of as a trinity of virtues that are critical to public policy research. The third overriding virtue, I'm sure all of you would agree, is quality, as in intellectual quality. The kind of quality that can only be attained in an atmosphere that fosters the right combination of discipline and imagination, an openness to constructive criticism from peers, and active encouragement of diversity of views. Those basic values, quality, independence, and impact, are important not just to Mr. Jefferson's University and to the center that Burkett Miller established here in Charlottesville, but they're also important to the institution that Robert S. Brookings founded in Washington, D.C., which is to say we have a common stake in upholding those values and defending them when they're in jeopardy, as I think is the case today. Now, before I elaborate on that point, let me give you a little bit of background, those of you who don't know it, about the Brookings Institution. This year we're celebrating our 90th anniversary, which makes us half as old as you are. But that still makes us among America's oldest think tanks. Robert Brookings was a Midwestern businessman and philanthropist who came to Washington at the invitation of another one of those UVA educated leaders who happened also to be a professor and a self-described Jeffersonian. I'm referring, of course, to Woodrow Wilson. We at Brookings think of ourselves as engaged in a form of education ourselves. We're certainly learning a lot in the way we go about our work, and we try also to help educate the public a bit. That's why we take a particular pleasure in being just about the only think tank in Washington that has a .edu rather than a .org address in cyberspace. Over the past 9 decades, Brookings and like-minded institutions, and there are quite a few now, have simultaneously concentrated on informing the public about the major issues of the day and also playing our part in generating ideas about how our nation might better govern itself and lead the world. Just a quick capsule of history here. In the 1920s, Brookings helped the government learn how to establish a more modern accounting and management system. In the 30s, we helped create Social Security. In the 40s, we had a significant hand in developing both the United Nations and the Marshall Plan. In the 50s, we worked to improve the presidential transition process and modernize the military. In the 60s, we contributed to the case for deregulation. In the 70s, we were very much involved in the design and creation of the Congressional Budget Office. Indeed, one of our best economists, Alice Rivlin, was the first director. In the 80s, we worked hard on tax reform. And over the last 20 years, we've turned our attention to developing new approaches to healthcare, tax policy, education, welfare, public service, campaign finance, and very crucially, the search for new approaches to international security, particularly in the wake of the end of the Cold War and with the dawn of the era that we now call globalization. After 9/11, we ratcheted up our search for more effective ways to organize the U.S. government to defend our homeland and advance our national interests abroad. Now, all of you know, of course, that issues of governance and leadership are by definition political. That's why we call, or I call, the village where I live the political village as opposed to the academical one. Political means that those issues are quite properly subject to the push and pull of partisan interests, and I might add, partisan passions. And that, of course, raises an issue, particularly for avowedly nonpartisan organizations like ours, which is to say yours, and Bill's and mine. What does the adjective nonpartisan really mean? And that's what I want to take just a moment to try to address. First, it might be helpful, I hope it won't be too pedantic, if I explain why we at Brookings are quite insistent on using the word nonpartisan rather than the somewhat more common word bipartisan. The reason is this: bipartisanship implies cooperation between Republicans and Democrats, and don't get me wrong, we're all for that. But in addition to the lonely but relevant case of Senator Jim Jeffords, there are a lot of Americans who don't associate themselves with either party. A truly nonpartisan institution respectfully rejects the notion that truth and wisdom are necessarily to be found in one major party or the other. Nonpartisanship, in other words, is a corollary of the very Jeffersonian principle of independence. It means that the public policy scholars most worth listening to, however they might register and whoever they might vote for, develop their ideas independently of any platform, agenda, or party line. They try to find solutions to today's most pressing and by definition complex problems, as opposed to devoting themselves to trying to find a rationale for their own pre-established views. Or to put it differently, nonpartisanship is a frame of mind, one that was captured wonderfully, I think, by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat with a PhD who worked for Richard Nixon. We're all entitled to our own opinions, said Professor Ambassador Senator Moynihan, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And that frame of mind prospers, I'm sure, on this campus. It also prospers in the inside the walls of Brookings. But it is not doing so well in the city where I work and where some of you visit from time to time. Brookings, as you may know, is located just off DuPont Circle. That puts it a mile from the White House, 2.5 miles from the Capitol, 3 miles from the Democrats and the Republicans' National Committee headquarters, and 8 miles inside the Beltway. That means that we are at what might be called ground zero of intense, often destructive partisanship. Those of you who tune in to what's happening in Washington could be forgiven for thinking that that city is a civility-free zone. Now note, please, that when I referred to partisanship, I put a couple of adjectives with it. I talked about intense and destructive partisanship. And the reason I qualified it that way is that partisanship in and of itself is actually a natural and healthy part of our political system. In fact, it's institutionalized in the two-party system. So in that sense, you could say that polarization is also institutionalized in our political system. Barry Goldwater had a valid point when he said that our elections should offer the American people a choice, not an echo. A second point that offers some consolation is that partisanship in the negative, divisive sense isn't always and everywhere as bad outside the Beltway as it is inside the Beltway, which is one reason I jump at every chance I get to get out of town, frankly. Our scholars have learned from their extensive work in cities and states around the country that mayors and governors tend to follow the doctrine associated with the name of Fiorello LaGuardia. When it comes to picking up garbage or fixing potholes, there is no Democratic or Republican way to do it right. A third point that I try to bear in mind, especially when I'm in the presence, as I am here this afternoon, I'm sure, of several professors of American history, is that polarization is not new, nor is it as bad as it's been in the past, say, for example, in the 1860s, or, for that matter, in the 1960s, when I was an undergraduate on one of the many troubled campuses in this country. But just because partisanship and polarization have gotten out of hand in years gone by is no excuse for being complacent when it happens in the present, especially when it is toxic and ominous in new ways. And that, I fear, may be where we find ourselves today. By any measure, the United States Congress is not just more polarized than it was a generation ago. The polarization has become structural. Let me explain what I mean by that. One of several reasons that there are fewer moderates in Congress is that electoral redistricting has made many seats safe for one party or the other. All too often that means either there's virtually no competition at all, or only meaningful competition, or the only meaningful competition takes place in the primaries, not in the general elections. And as a result, candidates spend more energy winning the support of activists in their own party rather than appealing to potential crossover voters from the other party. And then, once these candidates are elected and report for duty in Washington, they find that they are subject to leaderships on both sides of the aisle that have become much more dogmatic about enforcing their respective party lines. On top of that, as recent headlines have reminded us, legislators have more sense of obligation to the growing army of lobbyists who fund campaigns and who use legislators as surrogates in waging their own ideological and parochial battles. All of this has the effect of encouraging the noisier, more militant wings of the parties to square off against each other. Now, enter at this point in the narrative the Fourth Estate as an accomplice to the problem. Many in the media have an interest in covering politics as combat rather than a deliberative process. This is partly a function of the commercial environment in which newspapers, magazines, and networks compete for readers, viewers, and listeners. Major news organizations have watched their market share fall. They're losing their audiences to specialized publications, often involving new media, cable television, talk radio, internet websites, and blogs, all of which are more focused on narrowcasting to the tastes and opinions of consumers rather than broadcasting to the American public at large. These new competitors often slant their coverage in one direction or the other in order to go after constituencies with explicit political orientations and agendas. And even if these newcomers to the media marketplace do not succeed, as some fear they might, in driving the established networks and newspapers into extinction, there's no question that they have added to the pressure on the media at large to be more edgy, more opinionated, more polarized, and therefore more polarizing. Now, if I seem to be a little bit worked up on this subject, it's because I am. And it's because, as Michael alluded to, I spent 21 years as a journalist myself. And one reason I truly loved that profession was that it paid me a decent wage to continue my education, to see the world, and through columns and analytical pieces to participate in the national debate. But another reason that I loved the profession of journalism was that much of the proprietorship of the media, when I was getting my start, saw itself as being not just a business, but a public trust. And that's far less true today than it was then, much to the detriment of the public good. Now, you'll sometimes hear conventional wisdom to the effect that this whole phenomenon is essentially your fault or our fault, which is to say it's the fault of the American people. The media is just giving us what we want. And therefore, the audience of the media is to blame for the hyperpartisanship that one often finds there. Polling data suggests that that is simply not true. Self-described moderates are still a plurality among voters, as they have been for the last 40 years. Now, there's no denying that today's polarization does reflect some very real changes in our society. While the number of self-described moderates has remained a steady plurality of 40% over the last 40 years, self-described liberals and conservatives have sorted themselves more consistently along party lines. Like-minded people at either end of the political spectrum tend to seek out ideas, neighbors, and, not surprisingly, elected leaders who conform to their own views. Nevertheless, on most issues, including some of the most politically explosive issues, majorities or large pluralities tend to favor moderate positions. For instance, polls suggest that the country is nearly evenly divided between those who describe themselves as pro-choice and pro-life. And perhaps even more significant than that roughly even split is another set of polling data. 55% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal under certain circumstances, while only 26% believe that it should always be legal, and only 17% say it should never be legal. In short, the country is more moderate than the political background noise would often suggest. Citizens, I think, want their leaders and those who advise them or comment on their performance to be arguing about what's best for the country, not calling each other names. Citizens, in other words, want to see both the political establishment of the country and the media establishment of the country come together to be working on how to meet the greatest challenges. And as a general proposition, to accomplish that goal, there needs to be a balance between diversity of views and unity of purpose, a goal that is pretty well summed up by our nation's motto, E pluribus unum. Translated from the Latin into practice, that means politics should be more about finding common ground than about staking out battlegrounds. As for our present situation, I'll grant that there have been a few examples in recent years where even a bitterly fractious Congress has been able to muster bipartisan support for some important measures. Welfare and education reform, improvements in homeland security, reorganization of the intelligence community, tightening up the rules for corporate governance, just to name a few. But the fact still remains. Polarization has gotten in the way of common sense and sound policy where it matters a great deal, and you might even say where it matters most. And I would say, to just take a couple of examples, start with the function of Congress to provide advice and consent on judicial appointments. The fact that Congress last year narrowly avoided going nuclear on that subject was a wake-up call about the extent to which both the courts and the Congress have been affected, and I would say infected, by polarization and the wrong kind of partisanship. Another example where I think there's plenty of room for concern is on the issue of advocacy of an open international trading system. That's become kind of the third rail of American politics. You touch it as an elected official or a candidate running for office, and you're very likely to get fried. And it hasn't always been that way. During the Cold War, presidents and Congresses were able to build broad national coalitions in favor of free trade, regardless of which party controlled either or both branches of government. Such coalitions are much more difficult to forge today. A number of candidates in the 2004 Democratic primaries treated the outsourcing of service sector jobs as though that was the greatest menace to our prosperity and our way of life. And Republicans, long the party of free trade, still imposed steel tariffs and pilloried the president's top economic advisor, the very well-regarded Harvard economist Greg Mankiw, for merely suggesting that outsourcing might have some benefits for the American economy. So what should be a bipartisan effort to increase our competitiveness in the global economy and to address the needs of Americans displaced by international trade now risks becoming a contest to see who's in favor of the highest walls, either against imports or immigrants or both. And that's bad for everyone. It's bad for all Americans and bad for the world. More generally, the tendency to frame political choices in win-lose or winner-take-all terms has inhibited progress on transnational issues like global poverty, climate change, and non-proliferation. On the home front, it has had a comparable effect of generating more heat than light on issues like Social Security, health care, and worker training. But the most glaring example of this whole problem is our failure to restore our nation to a condition of fiscal sanity. The $300 billion annual budget deficit and our $5 trillion national debt pose a challenge that can only be met with the restoration of bipartisanship of the kind that we arguably haven't seen since Harry Truman made common cause with Arthur Vandenberg on how to rebuild Europe and wage the Cold War. And speaking of national security and foreign policy, we're going to need the same kind of bipartisanship if we're going to deal with Iraq in a way that salvages our national interest there. Now, on the surface, the positions of the political parties toward Iraq may have seemed to converge somewhat in the course of the 2004 campaign. And to some extent, that illusion, and I stress that illusion of convergence, persists today. After all, neither political party is proposing a drastic or immediate reduction of military force levels or military spending, but below the surface, a real chasm exists between Democratic and Republican bases on this issue. Less than half of those who identify themselves as Democrats believe that the best way to ensure peace is through military strength, while a lot more than half, nearly 70%, of those who identify themselves as Republicans are on the other side of that issue. That gap between the parties has grown considerably over the last decade. This gap has many implications, but certainly the most basic is that our political leaders will have a much harder time putting together a comprehensive national security strategy capable of gaining broad-based public support, let alone addressing specific challenges such as the one that we most conspicuously face today in Iraq. And I can tell you, as somebody who spends a great deal of time racking up frequent flyer miles and traveling around the world, that in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Far East, our friends are not just concerned by this structural divisiveness in our politics. They're truly alarmed, especially with regard to Iraq. Whatever their skepticism, and it tends to be considerable, about the way that war started, they do not want to see it end in an American debacle. They're also worried that the troubles we're having in Iraq are creating a backlash against international engagement on the part of the United States more generally. Maybe not isolationism in the sense that we remember that word from the 1920s and 30s, but in a latter-day version that combines xenophobia and protectionism. So let me now turn to the question of what all this means for institutions like yours and ours at Brookings, for institutions that are committed to a nonpartisan approach to public policy. For starters, I think, one way is to lead by example. That is, to create and sustain an atmosphere that actively and indeed proactively encourages collaboration on projects without regard to party lines, that brings people of different backgrounds and perspectives together. Now, that's a difficult balancing act. It requires that institutions like ours cultivate a diversity of perspectives within our own ranks. But it also requires that scholars with different viewpoints actively work together to address public policy challenges. When Brookings does a joint event or a joint project with an institution that is avowedly conservative or liberal, and we do reach out in both directions, our purpose, and we hope theirs, is to bridge the partisan divide, not to debate, however politely, back and forth across that divide. In the language that we use at Brookings, we try to avoid what we call the crossfire trap. Crossfire, I guess, has gone off the air now, but I'm sure you all recognize the term. The crossfire trap means letting the two outfits in question get typecast as representing opposite and predictable sides of some issue that's under national debate. If that's the Scylla, then the Charybdis is what we call the two-handed trap, as in on the one hand, on the other hand. That is, feeling that we or our scholars have always got to reflect both sides of any contested issue. That too is something to avoid. Our job should not be to forge compromises or to aim for the middle, which, by the way, is a moving target on the American political spectrum. Being nonpartisan doesn't mean being policy neutral, a phrase and a concept that is anathema to our goal of being policy relevant. Once scholars have used the best tools of social science to come up with innovative solutions to tough policy problems, they should be expected to put forward their policy findings and prescriptions forcefully. That doesn't mean that there is a Brookings line on any subject, any more than there is a UVA line, except maybe with regard to certain sporting events. Our attitude with regard to the products that we produce, that is in our case to analysis and recommendations that our scholars come up with, is to let the chips fall where they may, as long as our people adhere to the highest standards of intellectual rigor and collegial conduct. So what does that mean in practice? Well, letting the chips fall where they may means, to mix the metaphor, not loading the dice. The main combatants in today's political battleground, politicians, party leaders, and advocacy organizations, are always in search of ideas that serve their strategic objectives. And some research organizations are happy to supply those ideas. They take as their starting point a set of policy objectives defined by political operatives and then tailor their research to buttressing those preset positions. This approach we've nicknamed Jeopardy research, a reference to the TV game show where the host provides the answer and the contestants do battle to come up with the right questions. In our business, the competition also often revolves around very large cash prizes. As on other fronts of the political wars, money is a hugely powerful weapon. There are plenty of funders out there who think that they've got the right answers already and are looking to sponsor research that will support those answers. Quite simply, that is something that a truly independent, high-quality research outfit must avoid, literally at all costs. And the cost can be quite considerable sometimes. And while we're on the subject of money, a lot of it these days is going not into research per se, but into the presentation and marketing of that research. There was a recent study by Andrew Rich, who was a professor at City College in New York, that caught my eye because it punctured the myth among liberals that conservative research organizations outspend liberal and mainstream organizations. I was something of a, I tended to believe that myself. It turns out, according to Andrew Rich's research, that quite the contrary is true, and that avowedly conservative organizations were themselves considerably outspent. Yet, those conservative foundations and the policy institutes that they support had greater impact. In part, in very large part, because they put a significantly higher percentage of their budget into outreach than nonpartisan organizations tend to do. And by the way, avowedly liberal organizations have taken notice of this fact and are making adjustments accordingly. Several of those organizations have copied the war room model, focusing on the drafting of talking points for like-minded politicians, or developing so-called wedge issue legislation with the sole purpose of advancing the political fortunes of a political party or its candidates. Now, obviously, nonpartisan institutions like ours need to steer clear of any arrangement that smacks of compromising the quality and independence of its work. That said, we've got to be more focused on identifying our intended consumers, trying harder to reach them through various media that they use, from the web and email to talk radio and cable television, to handheld devices and, yes, cell phones. Otherwise, we will simply not be fulfilling the third element of our trinity, which is impact. Therefore, we have to convince our own funders that the ability to disseminate our work is crucial and therefore worthy of their support, along with the research itself, which we hope is also worthy of their support. A final word, if I could, about how we can strengthen the Trinity as a whole. We will enhance the quality, independence, and impact of our work if we're more aggressive and imaginative about partnerships with other institutions. The basic premise here is that while there will always be incompatibilities among institutions, and while there will always be an inescapable element of competition in those relationships, we absolutely must shift the ratio of competition to collaboration more in the direction of collaboration. At Brookings, we've increased our partnerships with scholars at other institutions across the political spectrum: the Urban Institute, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the Center for American Progress, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Hoover Institution, and, yes, the Heritage Foundation. I think that the next couple of years, i.e. as we head into the 2008 presidential election campaign, give us an opportunity for more broad-based collaboration than has been the case in the past. That's because the 2008 race is shaping up to be the first one in 56 years, since 1952, when neither ticket will feature an incumbent president or vice president. That could mean, let's hope it does mean, that the two parties will be more open than usual to fresh ideas without quite as much of a partisan stamp to them. We're going to be doing some sustained, focused, ambitious work of our own based on that premise, including through collaboration with outfits up and down think tank row and around the country. Now, in that venture, as in others, universities are vital partners for us. Universities like yours are, after all, the keepers of the gold standard for the intellectual values that we strive to uphold. They're the source of the latest methods for research and the disciplines that we try to apply to policy questions. And universities are, of course, also often the source of our best scholars as well. And many universities see value in joint projects with think tanks like ours. So on that note, I think perhaps I have come full circle to the common ground and the common mission between universities like this one and think tanks in the capital where I live. And with that, I would thank you all for your attention and look forward to a discussion, including on how we might work together in ways that would have made Thomas Jefferson proud, Burkitt Miller proud, and Robert S. Brookings proud. Thank you very much.